I'll go ahead and get started so that we can give Dr. Johnson his full time. First of all, I just wanted to thank you for your prayers with my recent hospitalization. I just really appreciate the care and concern and the prayers, so thank you very much. A class note that next week, Dr. Angela Carpenter will be with us. She's an associate professor of Reformed theology at Hope and a member of our church. She was the liturgist last week, if you'll remember, and her daughter was the liturgist the week before. And she'll be speaking on Calvin and the refugees during his time period, which we thought was appropriate. Today we are very pleased to welcome back to Third Dr. Fred Johnson, Professor of History at Hope.
Thank you, Joe.
Dr. Johnson has been teaching at Hope since 2000, and his primary field of study is 19th century U.S. history, but he has taught courses as varied as a May term on Vietnam and also a course on the history of U.S. foreign policy, 1775 to present. That's a big topic. He's also an award-winning public speaker, and today he'll help us recognize the beginning of Black History Month. So welcome back to Third, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning to you all. Good morning to you all. Good morning to you all.
Good morning.
In recognition of Black History Month, I'd like to frame this by having us remember or just keep in mind about what's been going on in Minnesota, around the country, with the raids and the people being picked up by mass people, and we don't know sometimes who these people are. And the question that I have for you is, when are we going to get this thing right? When are we going to finally get this right? If you go back to April 3rd, 1968, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in his last speech said, "All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper." If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly, somewhere I read of the freedom of speech, somewhere I read of the freedom of press, somewhere I read that the greatness of America, that the freedom of America, the greatness of America was the right to protest for rights. Then he mused a little bit, and he said, "Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead." He could be saying that today, couldn't he? We got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. And I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. 3 years earlier, just 3 years earlier, in 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson, in a speech to Congress on the Voting Rights Act that he was about to sign, said, "There's no constitutional issue here. There's no moral issue. It is wrong, deadly wrong, to deny any of your fellow Americans the right to vote in this country. There's no issue of states' rights. There's only the struggle for human rights. We ought not, we cannot, and we must not. We must not prevent this bill. We've already waited 100 years and more, and the time for waiting is gone." I recognize that there is outraged conscience of a nation, the grave concern of many nations, and the harsh judgment of history on our acts. 1 year before then, in 1964, the same president said, on the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, said, "Those who founded our country knew that freedom would be secured only if each generation fought to renew and enlarge its meaning. Each generation has been equal to that task. Americans of every race and color have died in battle to protect our freedom. Americans of every race and color have worked hard to build a nation of widening opportunities. Now, our generation of Americans has been called on to continue the unending search for justice within our own borders. Does that sound contemporary relevant? A century before then, on March 4th, 1865, in his second inaugural address, President Abraham Lincoln, on the occasion of his second election, said, "On this occasion, corresponding to this 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it. All sought to avert it. 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. Both North and South read the same Bible. They pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other." And then, almost as if he were stepping outside of himself to look around at what was going on, and getting rather philosophical, which is different for an inaugural speech, he said, "It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces." This is a theological link in here, because the reason he said it may seem strange that any man should dare to ask a just God, this is not just any God. This is the God that recognizes justice versus injustice, a God who knows the difference between right and wrong. And he's saying it may seem strange that any man is going to ask that God who knows the difference between justice and injustice, the God who's always waiting on the side of the poor against the strong, the poor against the wealthy, the weak against the strong, the outliers, the widows, and the orphans. You're going to ask that God to help you wring your bread from the sweat of other men's faces? Do you know what God you're talking to? But he said, "But let us judge not, that we be not judged. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which in the providence of God, in the mind of God, must needs come, but which having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible civil war, as the woe due to those by whom the offense came, shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away." And listen closely to this. But then he said, "Yet, if God wills that this war continues until all the wealth," catch that, "all the wealth piled by the bondsmen's 250 years of unrequited toil." My prayer is that nobody's ever experienced unrequited love. Unrequited love is where you're in love with somebody, they either don't know it, or they know and don't care, but either way, you're in love all by yourself. Unrequited. Unrequited. In 1865, the President of the United States is saying it's already been 250 years of unrequited toil, free labor for 2.5 centuries. But if God wills that it continues until all the wealth piled by the bondsmen, until all the wealth piled by the bondsmen, 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, until every drop of blood drawn by the lash shall be paid with another drawn by the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago. Still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. Then he finished up with malice toward none, and with charity for all. With firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, and to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves with all nations. 2 years earlier, on November 19, 1863, the same president took a train trip from Washington to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and looking out over the ruins of still picking bodies up off the battlefield at Gettysburg, he said, 70 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men, and we now know women, are created equal. And now, we are engaged in a great civil war. Now, y'all got to help me out here, because see, that sounds like a good idea to me. Conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men and women are created equal, and yet somehow somebody had a disagreement with that. What is wrong with people being created equal, and now we are in a great civil war? Somehow somebody found something wrong with that idea of equality and decided to fight about it for 4 years. Where nearly a million Americans will lose their lives on this idea. Because somebody thinks that all men and women being created equal is the wrong way to approach building a country. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. That test is still going on. It's not over with. 76 years earlier, before the president made that speech, after spending from May through September 1787 hammering out a new document called the Constitution, where they put a preamble to it, the Founding Fathers sent out for ratification by the states the document called the Constitution, where the first few lines in it said, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union." The Founding Fathers were flawed men, to be sure. I think it was James Madison who said, if men were angels, there would be no need for government. Men are clearly not angels. So there was a crying need for government. So they wanted a more, he understood that perfection for humanity will be on the other side of the grave, not on this side. So they wanted a more perfect union. They wanted to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. So we do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America. A mere 11 years earlier, Thomas Jefferson, having been given the job primarily writing the Declaration of Independence from the Committee of Five, John Adams said he's a better writer, so let him do it. He penned that document, which began with, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." There's that common theme being threaded through there. You see that? That they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, that is, there's an implication here that people don't just have rights by magic. You must go out there and get rights to secure them, because proactive, active activity of individual citizens. And it went on to say that governments are instituted among men. Governments are created by men, not the other way around. Men and women do not serve government. Government serves men and women. That's the general direction that it should be. So governments created by men, empowered by men, and doing what? And those governments, and here's the phrase from John Locke, those governments derive or get their just powers against injustice or versus justice. They get their just powers from who? The consent of the governed, the people. They don't just rule by fiat. Governments can do no more, no less than the people give them the power to do. So that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. If you move forward from there, the Declaration 1776, the Constitution in 1787, ratified in 1789, and then many years later, a civil war that begins with the firing of Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861, or essentially an argument over slavery. And like the president said, because you will find people today in the 21st century that still will argue with you until their cheeks pop. Say that the Civil War is about westward movement, industry versus agriculture, culture, different cultures, everything. But in 1865, he said all knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. Lincoln saying, I don't know how this thing started, but for whatever other excuse there is out there, westward movement, expansion, kicking Native Americans across the continent, differences of industry versus agriculture, north versus south, all those things count. But in the final analysis, all knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. You can trace that back, and the fact that it was a form of slavery based on one's skin color means even another layer of discussion there, because in 1860, the population was about 31 million people in the United States, 22 million in the North, 9 million in the South. Of the 9 million in the South, 3.5 to 4 million of them all were black slaves. Now, we do a simple thought analysis here and rule out the fact that 4 million people did not volunteer to be enslaved. They didn't take a lottery. They weren't there by accident. Something was going on in America since as early as the 1600s, the 1700s, the 17th century, with regard to the rise of racial slavery. And if there was racial slavery, that means that there was a problem with racism in America, even back then. There's an interesting colonial slave code, I think it was 1662 or 1622, that indicated that it stipulated that in Virginia, children produced by the union of a black woman and a white man, those children, those biracial children, would follow the condition of their mother. Meaning that if she was enslaved, so they too would be. Guaranteeing, now follow this, meaning that those children were in utero before they took their first breath of air, before their feet hit the ground, before the first ray of sunlight hit their forehead. They were already doomed to a life of servitude in perpetuity by that law. Something was going on, folks. Something was going on, and it stayed with America to produce a civil war. The Civil War ended on April 9th, 1865. And the country moved into a period called Reconstruction, where the 13th Amendment was passed ending slavery. The 13th Amendment, essentially, I'm going to paraphrase here, said that it is impossible for you to be enslaved or made to work against your will unless you have been duly convicted of a crime. Well, that sounds good. You can't enslave somebody and deprive them of their liberty unless they've been convicted of a crime. So what started happening in the South was they began passing things called vagrancy laws. That is, you must have a job where you can be tried in a court of law, be found guilty, and made to work against your will. Well, let's take a show of hands. If you're a black person in Mississippi in 1866, and you don't have a job, and that law is in force, you got to find a job. Are you confident that you're going to be employed? No, you're not. So therefore, if you're arrested and tried in a court of law and found duly guilty, you can be held against your will. That means you can be sit out there and put a sledgehammer in your hand, forced to work on the railroad with several other people in leg irons next to you doing chain gang labor, and you're doing that for the railroad company, who's paying the state a fee because they're getting labor for free. So it's not because it costs the state a whole lot of money. The railroad company's getting free labor. They pay a fee to the state. You're being made to work against your will. You're not being paid for it. What is it called when you're being made to work against your will and not being paid for it? Is there a word for that? They had the 14th Amendment that said, essentially, the 14th Amendment said that people would have access to equal protection of the law, due process, equal justice under the law. And another thing called dual citizenship. You are a citizen of the state in which you live in and the nation of which that state is a part. People thought that was the last word on it. And why did they do that? Because in 1865, when the Civil War ended, there's 4 million black people out there. They didn't sneak across the border. They didn't parachute in from Egypt. They were born right here. So what do you do with 4 million people who are in your country but are not citizens? So to answer that question, the 14th Amendment said they are citizens of the state they will live in and the nation of which they're a part. People thought it was a done deal. I tell my students all the time, I've been telling my students for years, do not rest on that. Do not think it can't happen here, like it's kind of happening today. I didn't think in my lifetime I would see actual debate on the 14th Amendment. I always hoped that it wouldn't happen, but they're actually debating whether or not the 14th Amendment should stick around. In 1935, in Nazi Germany, during one of the Nuremberg rallies, they passed something called the Nuremberg Laws, where millions of Jews, German Jews, many of whom felt themselves to be more German than Jewish, had their citizenship written out of existence just like that, with the stroke of a pen. The whole idea was to disenfranchise them, couldn't go to university, couldn't own a home, couldn't own property, couldn't buy land, couldn't own a business. It was to make life so difficult for them that they would self-deport. Does it sound familiar to you? Then came the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment was passed to address the issue of voting. Unfortunately, the 15th Amendment only applied to black men, not women. Black and white women would have to wait until the 20th century to get to vote. Even with the passage of those amendments, something called Jim Crow segregation essentially crushed the 13th Amendment, because you end up with chain gang slavery and chain gang imprisonment all the way into the 20th century. The 14th Amendment would be violated time and time again. From 1877 until 1968 or 1970, there will be 4,400 black men and women, and sometimes children, who will be lynched in America. You see, sometimes when people say to me, "Can you believe what's going on?" I go, "Yes, I can." Very easily. Given our history, I can believe it very easily. In other words, what's so different about this? If you know the history, this is just another iteration, another inflection point. What's happening yet one more time? It's not new. So take the fact that you have 3 constitutional amendments that people simply just ignore. Like, the Constitution is supposed to be what? The first and last word on the law, right? It's the law of the land, the foundation of it all. People simply ignore the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment for 100 years. Which is why in 1964, after a brutal civil rights movement, LBJ finally signed the Civil Rights Act into law. And then why it took, again, the 15th Amendment to reaffirm voting rights one more time. And why, after that, even after voting rights and civil rights were established, you find King making this last speech the day before he's shot down, before he's assassinated. So, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, in a recognition of the fact of these kind of struggles being waged again and again and again, he was the father of what's called Black History Month. At first it was Black History Week, because it was being, back in his time, he said, if we do not tell this history, it won't be known. Because if you don't tell the history, it's not being spoken about in schools, they either write it out or suppress it or just act like it didn't happen. Has anybody heard about how diversity, I'm told by my colleagues in Ohio that if you mention diversity in Ohio, you could lose your job as a teacher. Monuments being torn down, names taken off of buildings, these kind of things happening, and this is the 21st century. So, I'll end as I started. All we say to America is just be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China, or even Russia, or any totalitarian country like Castro's Cuba, Mussolini's Italy, Hitler's Germany, if I lived in any of those, maybe I could understand some of these illegal actions that are going on right now. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that in those places. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the freedom of America is the right to protest for rights. So like King said, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But unlike King, it doesn't matter to me. I've not been to my mountaintop yet. And I still would like to live a long life. Longevity does have its place. For as long as I'm here, I guess I just have to keep on speaking out on it and teaching about it. But I'm grateful that God has allowed me to go up to the mountain and get a glimpse of it. In that glimpse, I have seen a promised land, that which can be. History says it can be different. But I want to ask you all, when are we going to finally get this right? That's it. When are we going to finally get this right? From 1776, throughout our history up to right now, the documents have proven that we're moving toward, or we're trying to do the right thing. When are we going to finally get it right? I wish I had an answer for you. I don't. Thank you.
We have a few minutes if there are questions or comments for Dr. Johnson.
You are a historian, and I'm sure you know details about the fall of '72 racial incident on the USS Kitty Hawk aircraft carrier. I served on that aircraft carrier for 3 months immediately after that, in between schools. What's your take on that situation and the legal catastrophe that followed?
The what catastrophe that followed?
The legal catastrophe.
I'm not familiar with the legal catastrophe that followed, but I know that the black sailors on the USS Kitty Hawk, and here's the interesting thing about the USS Kitty Hawk, an aircraft carrier where there was a race riot during the Vietnam War. So sometimes you wish you were making this stuff up, but it's just not being made up. It's being fought in the Cold War, 1972, which is not the Stone Age, but 1972. During the Vietnam War, we're deploying troops, sailors, airmen, Marines, and soldiers to Vietnam to fight for freedom and liberty, at the same time that people in America couldn't sit down at a lunch counter in North Carolina to get a hamburger. And the sailors aboard the Kitty Hawk, had a whole raft of grievances about just abuses and mistreatment and so forth, that they just boiled over. The Navy, I know from being in the Marine Corps that the Naval Service has always been the last, or to drag its feet the longest on doing things when it comes to integration and promotion and equitability and so on. But again, I'm not familiar with the legal nightmare that followed. But the Kitty Hawk incident was the only aircraft carrier that happened on. There were about 2 or 3 others. So it was one of those things that caused impetus for the U.S. Naval Services to at least take a look at itself and make some improvements. I don't know where they stand today. But to me, the irony of that one has always been that it happened during the Vietnam War.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Obviously, the last election, a majority of us voted in a government that is pretty much counter to what you've been saying. Could you comment on the forces in America that allowed or encouraged that to happen?
Wow. Well, let's look at something like I'll look at it from the standpoint, relative to your question, I'll look at it from the standpoint of voting and affirmative action. Affirmative action became pretty much an outgrowth of the Nixon administration in 1969. It had been proposed before, but the moment it was adopted, it was because people began bellyaching about it and chipping away at it. Same thing with voting rights, same thing with the 15th Amendment, same thing with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. People were chipping away at it and chipping away at it and chipping away at it. So people took the long view of it to finally essentially defang it, to defang it or defund it so that people couldn't either enforce the laws or the laws became just pretty much vapid to begin with. So it's been a long, long process of slowly whittling away and eating at these different laws and amendments that have been passed to essentially get them to a point where all you do is just kind of a gust of wind and knock them over. And we're at a point now where they figured out that defunding certain agencies like the Fair Housing Administration can't do its job. As you can't have people to enforce the laws that are not being paid. So there's been constant pushback against this, and I showed my students a film the other day called "Don't Be a Sucker." It's a propaganda film from World War II, where there's this guy talking about, saying stuff like, "We real Americans know what the right thing to do is, or if you're a real American or a true American." Well, I asked them, well, what is a real American? What do they look like? And look, this is made during the World War II period, and I kid you not, the guy said, You see all these people with different accents that are getting all this money that you should have, Negroes getting jobs that you belong to me. There's a constant resentment out there that had not been paid attention to for a long time, and it was exploited. And it manifested and metastasized to deliver us into the result that we have right now. And the other thing that happened too, relative to affirmative action, people kept going on and on about that, and it was because the Civil Rights Act of 1964 had never been fully enforced the way that it should have been. Yep. Now, the company where I used to work at, this is where the senior HR rep told me this, that that she would get resumes, they're doing resumes differently now with AI and everything, but they would get resumes where sometimes, depending upon whether it was a woman or a person of color or somebody from a different country, different managers would fold with dog ear the resume like that. So as they pass it around to other people, they would know what's coming to them. It's kind of like a wink and a nod, like we don't want this one. And so affirmative action was finally passed because it said, hey, Organization X, if you live in a neighborhood or a community where they have so many of this and so many of that, so many of this, your workforce must also resemble that. People call that quotas. Then they started going out doing things like sending people to places where you weren't going to find what you needed. Like one time my boss wanted to send me to Butte, Montana to recruit black engineers. Oh my God. I'm sure there must be one person that lives in Butte, Montana. I don't know if they're an engineer though. So they did all kind of things to make sure that these things would not work. And so if you exploit the general resentment, there's a speech that Dr. King gave, which I should have brought up today. There's a speech that Dr. King gave in 1965 after the March on Selma for voting rights. He said that after the Civil War, the wealthy landowners who were abusing poor whites and black sharecroppers equally did all they could to make sure that black and white sharecroppers did not come together and form a coalition to go against those who were clearly abusing them both. So what did he feed them? He fed them Jim Crow. Fed the white sharecropper Jim Crow. And when he could not feed his children on that, he fed them more Jim Crow. When he couldn't get a job because of that, he fed them more Jim Crow. So they have been very expert at driving a wedge between those people that could actually do something to push back on them. And if you look at some of the statistics from the last election, there are many people that say, you know what, we think that this message about jobs and economic disenfranchisement is resonating in areas where it shouldn't have, or maybe it shouldn't have, but it did. And that's how we got where we are. I'm still puzzled by that. So it's been a ongoing historical element where you can, again, like I did with these different speeches, a common thread through those needles. There's something alive and going on in America which has to be dealt with, and we can't do that without knowing our history. Good question, thank you. Yes, sir.
Is the light at the end of the tunnel getting dimmer or brighter?
Can you repeat the question?
Is the light at the end of the tunnel getting dimmer or brighter?
Why does it sound like a train?
I was going to say it depends on if it's a train or a bicycle light. I don't know, because we've been here before. The reason why I structured this today like I did is because we've been at this since 1776. And so often we thought that the light was getting brighter and getting closer. We were almost there. Remember in 2008 when Barack Obama was elected? I remember being downtown at the Tulip City Hotel, and I remember somebody said, oh, we're finally a post-racial America. I went, hold your horses. It's good that this is happening, but I don't know that we're there yet. I mean, the fact that it took that long for a biracial president to be elected, I mean, I'm glad that he was elected, but it was over 200 years. So there's this pendular activity where we move forward and backwards and forward and backwards, 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. So I'm wondering, not only is there a light at the end of the tunnel, but we're going to finally have some progress that can be sustained to get some stability and move forward to the next level, because I'm convinced that now at this point in my life, the anti-democratic forces out there, they're always going to be out there to disassemble the democracy, and in this case, use the Constitution to destroy the Constitution, are always going to be there active and alive, which is why we can't be asleep at the wheel. So we must constantly be constant vigilance In the National Archives in Washington, D.C., there's a saying on one of the statues out there that says, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. We were asleep. We were asleep, and I dare say we are still asleep. So the light depends upon whether or not even our eyes are open to see the light. We've got to have our eyes open to see that it's coming either closer or farther. But if we're not doing our job, we cannot sit back on our laws and go like, we've gotten so far, oh, the battle's over with. It's never going to be over with because those elements in our country are always going to be there. We have been through so much in the United States, and oftentimes it's heartbreaking to think that we got to go back and revisit this stuff again and again and again and again. The fact that Emmett Till in 1955 could be murdered, you find two men that show up at his house, and they force their way into the home. They terrorize his uncle and his aunt, take the boy out there, torture him, murder him, and throw him into the Chattahoochee River. Then they confess to the crime and are not held liable at all. That says something about where we are then, and it's a reflection of how far we still have to go even today. But the fact that that happened after the Civil War was the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. And the fact that people can be getting treated the way they are today, we have an imperial presidency or an executive that's, as Barbara Jordan would say, swollen with power. The fact that we still have that going on says to me that we still have work to do. So I guess the good news is that there's a light. It's in a tunnel. I don't know how close it is just yet. Jeff.
I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit as a historian about the compromises that were made to get the Declaration of Independence adopted, to placate the southern states, and the same thing with the Constitution and the enshrinement of, for example, the creation of the Senate, where Wyoming has as much power in the Senate as California, with their population differences, the Electoral College, things like that.
Thomas Jefferson's first draft of the Declaration of Independence completely condemned slavery. Now, the irony here is that Thomas Jefferson is a slaveholder, owning slaves while he's writing the Constitution, while he's writing the Declaration, condemning slavery, and just castigating King George III for having created this system that he's made or poor us deal with. When he took the first draft to the Committee of Five, the delegates made him take that language out of the Declaration of Independence, which is why it's not mentioned at all. So the compromise in the Declaration of Independence essentially gutted that language out of it, but then it showed up again in the Constitution because at the Constitutional Convention from May to September 1787, in Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 3, in deciding upon representation and taxation, right, they decided they'd have a bicameral legislature, a House of Representatives and a Senate. The higher house, where the more seasoned, level-headed people would get bills from the lower house and work things out, kick them upstairs to the presidency to be signed into law or not. In determining taxation and representation on Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 3, they said that we're going to have a representative government. One house will be the House of Representatives, so it'll be a Republican democracy. That representation. So the question is, great, representation, how do you get the number? The number was gotten by adding the following formula. We're going to take the whole number of free persons plus indentured servants, which means that indentured servitude is still a thing in America in 1787. Whole free persons plus indentured servants minus Native Americans not taxed. You all know this, the answer to this. What was the rallying cry of the American Revolution? No taxation without representation. So if Native Americans are not being taxed, guess what they also don't have in government? A voice. The whole emphasis was, if you take my money, I expect to have a voice in government. That's the difference between the Americans and the British. The British using virtual representation. I can be the king over here, never set foot in America over there, and still be working for the good of the empire. The Americans said, no, you don't live in my neighborhood. You can't possibly know what's going on over here. I want somebody there speaking from me from my area. So Native Americans don't get that. So whole free persons plus indentured servants minus Native Americans plus 3/5 of all other persons. This is Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 3. Article 1, Section 9, Paragraph 1. The migration or importation of such persons as the states now think to import. We know people migrate. That's individuals go from here to Florida to get a job. People move around all the time. But today importation, what's that? Today it's called human trafficking. So Article 1, Section 9, the second part of the Constitution that acknowledged the slave trade, essentially said that the importation of human beings will not stop until 1808. Now, here's what a lot of people don't know, Jeff, is that in 1750 in England, a thing started happening called the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was a really strange and revolutionary thing that happened in England that made it the richest nation in Europe. But the thing that made the revolution so successful was the textile industry. The textile industry had a need for a raw material called cotton, produced in North America by black slaves. And the Founding Fathers, in Article 1, Section 9, Paragraph 1 said the transatlantic slave trade, which they would get $10 per person, will continue until 1808. So they're trying to figure out how to give themselves a 20-year window to stop their trade. But none of them, those men they were courageous, they had fought the British, they had won, they were well educated, they were experienced, they were battle hardened, battle tried, battle tested, and battle successful. But they were not clairvoyant, they weren't seers. Now, one of them could have foretold that in 1793, Eli Whitney would invent the cotton gin and make the cotton that slaves produced even all the more plentiful to feed to the English. So 1808 is going to come and go, and slavery in America is going to continue all into the 19th century. Then there was Article 4, Section 2, Paragraph 3, the Fugitive Slave Clause, which essentially says that if Jeff is in a slave state called Virginia, and escapes to a free state called Pennsylvania, doesn't matter what Pennsylvania's laws are, you still owe your labor to your owner in Virginia. You can be apprehended upon just by somebody saying that you belong to them. And already you have no civil rights, you have no standing in court, you can't serve on a jury, you can't vote. So those three things are put in place, was guaranteed that slavery was supported it was embedded, baked into the Constitution. It would be there until the beginning of the Civil War. That's where the 13th Amendment was supposed to end all that. So it's a very convoluted story, but they did that as a compromise to Southern delegates at the convention who said, if you don't put it in there, we're going to walk. And you could not have a brand new nation without the Southern states. People don't realize that in 1787, Virginia is a very big state. It goes from the eastern seaboard all the way to the Ohio River. It's not until 1863 that you get West Virginia that was kind of cuts down the size. So Virginia carried a lot of weight. With North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, you were not going to get rid of it. You got to have it. So I tell my students that they didn't go to the convention to end slavery. They went to the convention to establish a government, which is what they did. Their first priority. Thank you for that. Beck?
What can we do? And I think each one of us is eager to see some progress and to make a difference. We don't have the talent, the experience, the audience that you've had, the challenges that you've met. Keep it up. Thank you very much. And I think education is such a key part to this. Have you any comments in terms of how we're working with our educational system to help people understand what's going on?
Well, that's why I asked you all, when are we going to get this right? Well, yeah, thank you for that, but I appreciate that. But what do you all think American citizens can do? Like, yeah, it's just me, I'm just one person. But what can we do collectively? 77, just like one of you all pointed out, 77 million people voted for this condition the last election. And people can vote for whoever they want. That's fine, right? But what can we do to minimize this, to keep this from happening? I want to say again, what can we do to right the ship? That's my challenge to you. What can we do? I can say more education. I can say, more people should be more informed, be more involved, be more in tune, be more engaged. Well, some people being engaged is hitting the like button on the Facebook page. That's not activism. That's called slacktivism. So what can we practically do here in Holland, Michigan, in West Michigan, to push back against this?
So I would say, fear not. So Old and New Testament, #1 command, to fear not. And during your narrative, much of what is used to sequester votes is fear. It just seems to me like if we could work on that in each of ourselves, there might be more room for us to do the right thing.
And while I would say fear not, yes, but by all means, don't be fearful, but also don't be naive. Because see, what happens is, if it's happening to somebody else, a lot of people don't get involved in stuff that's happening to them till it affects them. And I get that. That's a human condition, all right? If it affects me, why should I worry? Okay, can you guarantee that? Can you guarantee that? What's the thing that Martin Niemöller said? When they started rounding up, you know, I'm gonna mess up. When they started rounding up socialists, I did not get involved because I wasn't a socialist. When they started rounding up trade unionists, I didn't get involved because I wasn't a trade unionist. When they started rounding up communists, I didn't get involved because I wasn't a communist. When they started rounding up Jews, I didn't get involved because I wasn't a Jew. And then they came for me. And then there was no one left to speak for me. So, would that happen? I don't know. But we also, and people might say, well, that could never happen in America. We also thought you would never see mass people in America riding around, just jumping on people and rounding them up and putting them in prisons for profit. That's not imagined. It's happening right now. So, yeah, be fearful, be courageous, fear not. Be courageous, but also don't be naive. Be aware of what's going on out there. Be aware of what the opposition is, and that they're not going away quietly or soon. So it's going to take being informed, being engaged, and being active, and being vigilant all the way, all the time. I'm convinced at this point in my life that this is not going away anytime soon, if not ever. So I can't afford to sit back on my laurels any given day until I finally check out and think this is going to solve itself. It won't. It's going to take the activity of American people.
I have a question here. How do we engage our family members to talk to their friends about the severity of the social situation that we're confronted with? You know, if we don't protect our offspring and have our offspring talk to their friends, this is a problem throughout all America.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been here since the beginning. And until we can educate our offspring, because that's an easy conversation. You might not get the results that you want.
Or not. You know, it's one of those
Can you
conversations.
repeat the question?
Yeah, how do we engage how do we talk to our family
Yes.
and our children to get them engaged and understand what's going on? So that's one of those kind of conversations you have at Thanksgiving, which you really shouldn't have at Thanksgiving. But the response is, I don't mean to be glib here. The response was, well, just talk to them. No, they had to be talked to, informed, engaged, educated. I'm not kidding you when I said to you all that a colleague of mine said that in Ohio, in certain school systems, if you mention the word diversity, you can lose your job. That has a chilling effect. And I get it, that people economically, that kind of economic pressure on people was used in the civil rights movement. If you get involved in that movement over there, you can lose your job. So what happened? Even black pastors were telling Dr. King, hey, you're making life hard for me over here at my congregation, just back off for a minute. So what do you do when people are going to put food on the table, but they also, to say at the expense of their rights? Given the choice of civil rights or food, people will take food first because it's more immediately necessary. So we got to talk to our families, but also our friends, and there has to be enough people who see this as not just something that's affecting the community over here, but this community over here have enough empathy and compassion, which is definitely at a deficit today, I think. But to understand that if it affects somebody over here, it also, like a spider web, you touch one web over here, it causes some activity over there. It's all interconnected. So we have to understand that it's not just black people, it's not just Hispanics, it's not just Irish Catholics, it's everybody involved in America. To have this vision, this nation become the vision that we know it can be. There means constant activity, constant exposure, constant pressure. Wherever and however you can make it, Willis. Go ahead. There's one more question.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that Steve asked about fear, because my suspicion is that many of those who have supported this administration do so out of fear. They're afraid of the future. They're afraid of the economics. They're afraid of AI. They're afraid that what they grew up in is no longer America. And my question is, how do we help overcome their fear, if indeed that's an accurate diagnosis of the situation?
Oh no, it's rightful to be fearful. I mean, do not fear, but at the same time, do not. What's the saying? Just because you're not paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to. Just because you're not paranoid does not mean they're not out to get you. I think every person will have to weigh for themselves what they stand to gain or lose in challenging a system like that. Things that are going on right now. And I would say, in closing, I would say, do what you can, where you can, as you can. I think it was Booker T. Washington that said, we're going to do the best we can with what we got, where we are. Do the best you can with what you have, where you are. And because in these days, I think every little bit will count. Every word spoken, every protest move, every committee or community join, every organization join, it all will go into the general movement to push back against this system that has been twisted to be what it is right now, which is far different than what other people could have imagined or hoped for. Yeah. You all have been wonderful this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much.